The square root property gives us a way to solve equations where you have a square, like this, x squared is equal to b. It tells us that to get rid of an exponent of 2, you can apply a root with an index of 2. So take the square root of both sides, and if x squared is equal to b, then x is equal to plus or minus the square root of b. You have two answers, plus or minus, because when you square a number, whether that number is positive or negative, squaring the number is going to cancel out the sign. A negative times a negative also gives you a positive. So for example, if we want to solve x squared equals 36, this equation is asking what number, when you raise it to the second power, gives you 36. And we know that 6 to the second power is 36. But we also know that negative 6 to the second power is 36. So you get two answers, 6 and negative 6. To solve using the square root property, you would take the square root of both sides, and on the right side you have to take into account that every number has a positive and a negative root, positive and negative square root. The square root of 36 is 6, and you get two answers, positive and negative. So to solve an equation like 3x squared equals 15, before we apply the square root property, we have to have the square part by itself. And so our first step would be to divide each side of the equation by 3. And on the left side, the 3's will cancel. On the right side, 15 divided by 3 gives you 5. You get x squared equals 5. Now that the x squared is by itself, now you can apply the square root property and you get your two answers. The square root of 5 cannot be simplified. Don't forget the plus or minus so that you get both the positive and negative answers. And if y minus 7 squared is equal to 9, so in this case, instead of just having a number like x being squared, you've got an expression, y minus 7, that's being squared. Regardless, you still want to get rid of that square. And to get rid of the square, you apply the square root property. So when you apply the square root property on the left side, the square will go away. You're left with y minus 7. On the right side, you get plus or minus the square root of 9, and the square root of 9 can be simplified, gives you 3. So you get y minus 7 is equal to plus or minus 3. To solve for y, you'd want to add 7 to both sides. When you add 7 to the right side, put it in front of the plus or minus so that you get y is equal to 7 plus or minus 3, and then from there simplify. You get y is equal to 7 plus 3, that'll give you 10, and y is equal to 7 minus 3, that'll give you 4. And so your answers are 4 or 10. Okay, for our last example with the square root property, actually we have two more. Solve x squared plus 16 is equal to 0. Again, to solve the square root property, you want to get that square part by itself. And so I'm going to bring the 16 over to the right side. To do that, we're subtracting 16 from each side of the equation to get x squared is equal to negative 16. And then to undo the square, apply the square root to both sides, and you get x squared can't be negative, that's not a real solution. But if you do apply the square root property, There we go. You get plus or minus the square root of negative 16, which is not a real number. So there's no real solution, but we do have imaginary solutions. The square root of 16 is 4. The negative underneath the square root gives you an I. You get x equals plus or minus 4i as imaginary solutions. Okay, and the last example. Solve 2x minus 1 squared equals 20. So here I have the square on the left side. To undo the square, apply the square root property, and you'll get 2x minus 1 is equal to plus or minus the square root of 20. The square root of 20 can be simplified. 20 is 4 times 5, and the square root of 4 is 2. So the square root of 20 simplifies to give you 2 square root of 5. So from here, 2x minus 1 equals plus or minus 2 square root of 5. You want to work to isolate the x. Start by adding 1 to both sides. That'll get the x term by itself. Remember that when you add the 1, put it in front of the plus or minus. To get 2x is equal to 1 plus or minus 2 square root of 5, and then solve for x by dividing by 2. Now on the right side, you could divide the entire right side by 2, or you could do it term by term. It's really up to you. I've left it as one fraction. X is equal to 1 plus or minus 2 square root of 5 divided by 2.